The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to wait for a little bit to allow more people to sign on. Paul was saying there was difficulty signing on. If you wouldn't mind using the chat box and letting me know if any of you had difficulties in signing on. We were considering sending out an email to the registration list to say if you had problems, try this number instead. Did anyone aside from Paul have difficulties getting in? I see a question. April says no concerns. Okay, good to know. So at least some of the time it's working as it should. Thank you, April. Anybody else? So I see we're up to just 4 attendees and we're expecting more people than that. So I'm thinking some folks may be having difficulties. So I will ask your patience with us while we're trying to, so Shauna says no issues. Melissa says I had a hard time getting on. So Melissa, I unmuted you. Can you tell me what you had to do in order to get on? And maybe not unmuted from your end, or perhaps just type in. Melissa, is that you? Okay. All righty. Well, I'm gonna, like I say, thank you for your patience. I'm gonna go ahead and try and send to the registration list what Paul had to do in order to get on, and hopefully help people out if they're struggling. Oh, Melissa, I see that. You don't think your microphone is working? Okay, thank you. Yes, Paul, your phone did actually get through quicker.
That's fine. Interesting.
All right. So I have now sent out the email to the group. All right. So while that's going out, I think, Paul, actually it would probably be fine to go ahead and start because we're definitely going to record this session today. This is the monthly Supervisor Learning Collaborative for supervisors of FCS and IPS programs. And today we're going to talk about fidelity reviews. I will mention while we're kind of waiting for others to sign on that we're going to be incentivizing fidelity reviews again this year, meaning that agencies will be able to apply for a grant in order to defray some of the cost of participating in fidelity reviews or in sending staff to be fidelity reviewers. So kind of stay tuned for that information. It will be coming out later. If you have questions, feel free to contact me. In the meantime, Paul, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Dawn. Today, we're going to talk all about the fidelity review process for individual placement and supported employment. The agenda for these calls throughout the year, I've tried to keep it pretty brief agenda. for a couple reasons. One is I don't want to spend the entire hour talking, and two, I usually try to bring some questions for thought and for people to consider, at the end of my presentation. So I would like to be able to have some sort of dialogue to make sure that we're answering questions that people have out there. So we're going to start with a really broad, high-level overview of the Fidelity Scale, and then we're going to move into the Fidelity Review process, and then I'm going to give you a roadmap for the Fidelity Review activities that, if you're an IPS provider, you can expect during your Fidelity Review visit from Fidelity reviewers. So the first thing, I know earlier in the year I did not have this slide in many of my presentations, and I've just kind of started putting it in here a couple times in every presentation. The best place I could direct you for any questions or questions about forms or resources is to the IPS Employment Center at ipsworks.org. They have just tons of stuff available for free on their website. They've got all of the research available, so if you're having discussions where you're trying to convince somebody that this is in fact an evidence-based practice, those research summaries are very vital for that. And they've got everything up to and including the actual documents that you might be using in your IPS program for various activities. So ipsworks.org, it's great. Favorite it. You will visit it quite a bit. I do still to this day, just to see, well, what is out there for this or that or the other. So the Fidelity Scale overview, like I said, this will be brief and very high level. The IPS Fidelity Scale is broken into three sections. One evaluates the staffing of the IPS program. The second section evaluates the organization's kind of culture of IPS employment. And then the third actually evaluates the services that the IPS team provides. There's 25 items in these three sections, and each item is scored with a Likert type scale. So 1 would be no implementation, a score of 5 would be full implementation. And you take all of those individual item scores and you add them up, and that really ends up being your Fidelity score. It's important to consider, for those of you that are doing IPS and have never had a program that has Fidelity Scale associated with it, if you meet the threshold of Fidelity, and let's say you have 1 point more than that threshold of Fidelity, your program still has Fidelity to the model. Now you have a different level of Fidelity than someone, for example, that might have 120 points on a scale, but nonetheless, you have Fidelity. It's less of a A, B, C, D, F grading system and more of a pass-fail grading system. And that's important to think about as you do the work. There are a lot of things in the scale that some organizations just aren't prepared to fully implement yet. And so there's flexibility in the Fidelity Scale. The Fidelity Review process, and so I did not have my slide of disclaimers on here, Dawn, that I should have had about how the things I talk about aren't necessarily Washington specific. I'm going to talk to you kind of about my experience with IPS, and my experience is that I'm an IPS provider in Illinois and a Fidelity reviewer in Illinois. The way we do it in the Fidelity reviews in Illinois is we do a 2-day Fidelity review. We have at least 2 reviewers, but we always have 3 in every Fidelity review. What we do is we use the IPS Fidelity Review Manual to guide our interviews. And some things that Fidelity reviewers do, when they're at your agency, they might observe team meetings, they might look at employment specialist calendars, and that can either be on the computer or in like a planner. A lot of interviews, we interview staff, we interview clients or consumers, vocational rehabilitation counselors, benefits counselors, clinical staff. Sometimes we review interview the executive team, like the CEO, and then reviewers typically go shadow one of the employment specialists or the employment specialists while they're doing job development out in the community. Most employment specialists schedule these activities, but there have been a few times where we get to an agency and we go out on job development, and let's say we're at a a local small business restaurant, and maybe they're very, very busy, and the hiring manager doesn't have any time to talk with us. And so rather than wait or be interruptive, the employment specialist just takes us someplace else. The Fidelity review schedule should include some very specific things. It should include an opportunity for the reviewers to observe team meetings, specifically the employment team meeting, and any team that you would describe as a mental health team. So in IPS, which was kind of created with a target population of adults with serious mental illness, there's a lot of language about how the employment team is connected to the mental health team. So if you are working as an IPS provider and you don't specifically have a mental health team that you're connected with, I know on a couple other calls, and Dawn and I have had some conversation, how you can think about how other groups of people that you regularly meet with and get referrals from could be considered that mental health team. And I can talk more about that at the end if people have specific questions. Executive team interviews should be on the calendar. Interviews with the IPS supervisor, employment specialist, and mental health providers. So if there's let's say a therapy clinic that provides a lot of referrals to your employment team, we would want to talk with somebody from that therapy clinic. And interviews can be 30 minutes. We prefer to have them face to face. If they have to be by phone, that's okay too, but it's not preferred. Other interviews that are important to have would be with vocational rehab counselors, benefits counselors, clients who either have received the service or are receiving the service, and their family members. I talked about the observation of job development in the community. Also, reviewers would want to take a look at what I call program data. And so that might be quality assurance data, data surrounding job starts, logs for job development activity, any Fidelity action plans that organizations might have to improve their score. And then there is a chart review element to a Fidelity review. And that is one of the things in my experience that tends to take a while. And part of it is because each organization kind of has their own way of maintaining records. Some have electronic medical records, some have paper charts, some have a real hybrid of the two systems. Some places have the IPS documentation separate from the mental health record or the electronic health record. So all of those nuances tend to make things, the chart reviews, just take a little longer. So it's important to schedule those early in the 2 days and not save them until the end. I have on this slide and the next just some sample schedules. Now this one goes from 8:30 to 5 p.m. Certainly there's flexibility in time. Interviews might end early. Some might go over. Chart reviews might not take as long as we thought, or they may take longer. So it's important to, as a provider, to go into your Fidelity review with an understanding that things might not go exactly as you have them timed out. With that being said, though, reviewers should be sensitive to anything that you've got scheduled. For example, like a client and their family member coming in, or a therapy staff member who's scheduled at 11 to talk with the reviewers. The principle of the review is not to disrupt everything. We certainly want to try to be on time as people are scheduled. So if you're undergoing a Fidelity review with your organization and things are getting off track time-wise, I encourage you to make that known to the reviewers and then have a real open, honest discussion about how you can get the schedule back on track, and shuffle things around so that everybody can end when they need to end and have the interviews when they need to have the interviews. In this sample schedule, again, it's just an idea. Typically on day one, we have folks just kind of start with an overview of the organization, its IPS program, a little history. That's good, for the reviewers to hear, because you can't assume that they know everything about your organization. I've been doing Fidelity reviewing a lot of years, and I have this theory that at mental health centers across America, 9 a.m. is the time when everybody's in a team meeting. So it never fails when I get to an organization. 9 a.m. is when the team meetings tend to start. A couple interviews with case managers, and I put a note here that Fidelity reviewers can split up for these interviews. So feel free to schedule 2 case managers and a client if you have 3 reviewers, all at the same time of day, and you can have each reviewer take one of those interviews. that's a way to get a lot of the activity done, but stay on time. Interview with the agency executive director. Sorry about that. Client group interview, break for lunch, some chart reviews, benefits counselor interview, and then some time to shadow job development with employment specialists. And I noted here again that reviewers can split up for those observations. That's important to think about too for job development. And I always like to encourage teams to remember that when you're doing observations of job development as a fidelity reviewer, the last thing I want to do is have the employer or have the employment specialist kind of have this awkwardness around my presence. And so often I just tell them that I'm observing or I'm shadowing you today. They don't really need to know at that moment everything about the fidelity review. That I think that's something you can tell them when you're setting up the time, if you're scheduling job development, that we're having fidelity review, and the reviewers like to see how I do what we call job development, and it's really just what our meetings are called. That goes a long way, I think, to getting through some of that awkwardness of having a person with you. On day 2, then it ends up being, another meeting, a couple more interviews, and I have 11:30 in chart reviews until 1. Day 2 typically has a lot of question marks in and around lunch and in the afternoon, because so much of that depends on what happens in day 1 and how much you get done. So when you set this up, I would encourage you to kind of think about how you could use day 2 to catch up a little bit and get those last looks at things for the reviewers. So this, as you can see, is not scheduled until 5, and I don't think I've been to a fidelity review where both days are booked until 5. Usually there's just some space on day 2 to kind of flex out if you need to. So some of the fidelity review activities that are important to plan for, the team of reviewers, first of all. So you need to make sure you've got some space that can accommodate a team of reviewers, a place for them to kind of have as a headquarters during their couple days with you. Chart access for the reviewers. Some organizations with paper charts, they just bring in the charts and they stay in the room until the reviewers are done. With electronic medical records, it's a little different. Some organizations are able to grant what they call surveyor or review access to their electronic medical record, where basically they give you a kind of a one-time login, and you still have to have somebody kind of guide you through the record, so you know where to look for everything. Other organizations don't allow for a unique password and login for a reviewer, but they will have someone, often an employment specialist, do all the clicking around in the record for the reviewer, and the reviewer then could just be saying, okay, show me your vocational profile, show me your job start plan, show me your disclosure, your evidence of disclosure in the record, and then the employee can kind of click through the record. You'll want to just think about beforehand the space for the activities, like the meetings, the individual interviews, the client interviews. And I had something happen on a fidelity review recently I'd never had happen before, and it's really kind of an interesting thing to point out. This organization had 2 different clients scheduled at the same time for individual interviews, and one of the reviewers was late coming back from job development observation. So what they did is they had those 2 clients do kind of a group interview with one of the reviewers, and all of that is not uncommon. But the thing that is uncommon, afterwards, one of those clients approached me and wanted to tell me how uncomfortable they were coming in for an individual interview and kind of being put in a position where they were in a group interview, and it made them feel very uncomfortable, and they felt they weren't able to fully answer the questions without disclosing a lot of personal information. And so I only tell you this story, first of all, because it's recent in my mind, and second of all, those are things to think about when you're selecting clients to interview and their family members. It's important for you to think about, is this a person who would share freely in a group interview setting, because the reviewers are there to really hear how good your teams are doing. So, and then I talked a little bit about shadowing job development, and that's, the plan for it. I think you certainly want to pick the right employer, somebody with the right relationship, to show the good work you're doing to the reviewers. Interviews, I talked a little bit about this. They can occur simultaneously. Feel free to use that, to your advantage to kind of get some of these things checked off the list. And you've got this long list of people here who need to be interviewed during a fidelity review. And I've talked about them a few slides ago too, so nothing different there. A lot of people ask me when they're talking to me about fidelity reviews and kind of the mystery behind them. These are the things they want to know from me. It's what can I expect from the questioning? Is it like an interrogation? And it's not. The fidelity reviewers, they're just asking questions to find out how you do IPS so that they can compare it to the fidelity scale and try to give you a very realistic evaluation. The kind of questions fidelity reviewers really are asking are questions about processes. And they're going to want to know everything from referral through discharging a client. How do you do the work of IPS? And then processes for communicating with teams. That's why we're observing team meetings. That's why we're asking questions about how many teams you're assigned to, maybe. We ask a lot of questions about relationships. They sound like different kinds of questions, but they're really about the relationship. How do you help clients? Your relationship with clinical staff, within the organization, and within Voc Rehab. And really, the goal is to fully understand how you do IPS to try to give you the fairest score possible. One of the things I love about IPS is it is not a gotcha. This review is not like a typical survey from, CARF or Joint Commission or any of those surveying bodies, which have their place and their purpose, don't get me wrong. But IPS is really, we're not here to catch you in a wrong answer. We're not here to do anything like that. The only thing we want to do is hear how you do IPS. And so often the questions we're asking are kind of, how do you do this? And sometimes, especially people who aren't affiliated with IPS, like those therapists or, other people on your team, sometimes they don't understand the context. And so just as a side note, as a reviewer, I like to start every interview with a brief context sort of discussion to let people know why I'm here, what I'm doing, and tell them, if you think the question is out of line, please let me know. Other things to think about in a fidelity review include those chart reviews, and that really just shows the timeline of IPS treatment in your organization. So, we're going to want to look at your intake forms if you have them, and do those intake forms have specific questions on them related to interest in employment. We'll want to look at this, what I call supplemental material, so things like brochures or newsletters you might have, any quality assurance records you might have at your organization that include IPS, supervision notes, supervisor data tracking. And if you haven't looked at the fidelity scale yet, I encourage you to do so. There's some very specific things IPS wants an IPS supervisor to be tracking and doing. So it's important to show that evidence during the fidelity review. So the fidelity scoring, so we've done 2 days worth of questions for everybody, and we've bothered everybody for 2 days. And so what do we do with the scores? So IPS fidelity reviewers use what's called consensus scoring, and what that is, so again, in Illinois we use 3 reviewers, and the consensus scoring is if I think some agency is a 3 on this item, and Bill thinks they're a 4, and Jane thinks they're a 3, then we can have a discussion and come to an agreement about whether it's a 3 or a 4. And the reason we use consensus scoring is because so often the fidelity reviewers hear similar information, but depending on who they're interviewing, they may hear a little bit more information in this interview as opposed to this other interview. So one of the reviewers might have some information that the other 2 don't have when they did their preliminary scoring. It's also important for you to know that the gradient between scores is not equal. So moving from a 1 to a 2 is not the same as moving from a 4 to 5. Often, moving from a 4 to 5 is incredibly more difficult than a 1 to 2. Moving from 1 to 2 often is, presence or absence of something. And as you get to a 3 or a 4, it's present. Yes, you have it, but are you doing it at the frequency you need to be doing it? And did we see evidence that you're doing it at the frequency you need to be doing it in order to get a 5? And there are a few items that have what I call, I don't think it's not a technical term, but auto scoring rules. So team size, IPS supervisor, certain calculations. If certain thresholds aren't met, the way the fidelity manual reads is you can't score above a certain score. So be familiar with those sorts of auto scoring rules that are in the fidelity scale. And again, for excellent super easy to access resources. I encourage you to go to this website. It has everything you could ever want to know about IPS on there, way more than I could ever share with you in a series of webinars for sure. But it is really the playbook for you. And what I usually do after these webinars is I send my slide deck to Dawn, and then Dawn distributes it to whoever's on the call. So you will have a copy of this available to you as well. So what I've been doing with these webinars is just some questions for reflection, and I'll just kind of go through all three of them. We don't have to do them one at a time. But it's something, I'm sure you have questions. It's maybe just a way to kind of get a dialogue going between us here. So one, what are the aspects of the Fidelity review process that you would like more clarity on? I know I kind of moved through this a little quickly, but are there certain things that you want me to expand on or touch on in greater detail? Or I would even say, things that were just a mystery to you. The next question, I think, is more in line with what I hear from people who have not yet had a Fidelity review. So what have you heard, or what are your fears about a Fidelity review at your agency? And then the last question is, what did I leave out that you really thought, you hoped you would hear about today? So I'll just wait a few seconds and kind of let you all process those questions. You can either enter a question in the chat or an answer in the chat, or I think they can raise their hand if I'm right, Dawn.
Yeah, you're right, Paul. They can raise their hand. They can type a question in the chat box. There are a couple of ways to do that kind of thing, or just ask to be unmuted, and I can unmute anybody who wants to speak. In looking through the list, I do see a couple of folks who have been Fidelity reviewers with me, so they may have some interesting perspectives too. You mentioned earlier that you have your disclaimer in relationship to, what you're talking about is not necessarily Washington specific. I think the very few differences that we've had is some of our teams have been larger than yours because of the contracting process that we went through, the incentive process. We ended up having teams that at times were 4 or 5 people, which was kind of hard to do, 4 or 5 reviewers.
Right.
But so much of the rest of it is the same as what we've done. One of the things that the group is thinking that I would just discuss is that because in the state of Washington, our foundational community supports agencies who are doing IPS are not always a behavioral health agency. They've had some real challenges with, some of the Fidelity items that relate to treatment team meetings and attending those and being in close proximity to the individuals who are referring to them and number of teams that they're on per the referrals and that kind of thing. That some of those things have been really challenging. And so we've had agencies score under the lowest category, which is not supported employment. And what I've had to explain to people is it's not supported employment per Fidelity. That doesn't mean that as an agency they're not doing some wonderful things.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of hard to swallow. Go ahead.
Sure, and there's even some research out there on the IPS Works website about how, first of all, if people don't know, it's important to say, I guess, to level set, that IPS has been shown to be effective with many, many populations beyond adults with serious mental illness. And the favorite that I like to point out is there were several studies done using IPS with veterans who were seeking employment. Now, these are not folks with disabilities or any sort of formal diagnosis. These are just people who have a history of military service. And so IPS, kind of the leaders of IPS need to, I think, understand how the research needs to maybe influence the Fidelity scale or the Fidelity manual in those ways. And so, for example, in Illinois, we are now using it's a second Fidelity scale to be used with organizations that serve youth, and they do IPS. And so it's the youth scale, and it has some additional content, and it's the IPS Fidelity scale plus some additional content on supportive education. And so I do think going forward, we will see kind of the Fidelity scale, kind of those specific mental health phrases kind of maybe generalized a little bit in order to allow for things like organizations who don't have any sort of clinical team connection, but let's say they provide IPS services in the context of a peer drop-in center, or they serve. I know there's IPS organizations in my area at like Goodwill, and so Goodwill they don't have a treatment team available to them, and so the question always ends up being, well, where do you get your referrals? And let's talk about what that team is that sends you the referrals.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish I had a blanket statement that, yes, it's allowed, or no, it's not allowed. But unfortunately, really, I think the reviewers have to get into an organization and really understand how the organization is doing IPS before they can make a determination that, kind of like, yes, it counts, or no, it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any shorthand that gets anybody to a quick answer, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. I know as we've been doing Fidelity Reviewer training, in the orange and turquoise book, I believe it is, and actually I've got one right here. Maybe I'll just take a quick look. There's one place where it talks about agencies that are not part of a behavioral health agency, and kind of a then what type of a thing. And it talks
Right.
about looking at the support team that's built around the person, that regardless of what the agency is, the people that we serve have multiple challenges, and they have multiple agencies in their lives. And if they have an agency in their life, they should be someone that's contacted to be part of that support team, and they should be one of the agencies, or the staff from the agency that are collaborating to make sure that everybody is on the same page. So
Right.
It's not actually in the orange and blue book, it's in the Fidelity Reviewer Manual. If I remember right, it's like page 49 and 50. It talks about support teams if it's not a behavioral health agency.
Yeah, I do recall that section. I don't have my manual in front of me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just
if any of those organizations are on the call, I encourage them to, in this kind of safe space, talk through how you can conceptualize that for your organization. It's a tricky part of the scale, and like I said, I do think at some point we're going to see the Fidelity scale tweaked a little bit, maybe not changed so much that it's disability specific, for example, but I do think you'll see, instead of mental health treatment team, you'll see that over time end up changing to a support team, not mental health team anymore, but support team, in order to allow for this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I ended up, IPS does an international face-to-face meeting once a year, but they do, I think it's every other month, they do meetings with all the different agencies who choose to be part of the phone meeting in order to discuss various things. And they talked this last time, which was last week, I think it was, about the fact that Sarah Swanson took the youth fidelity scale out and actually implemented it in an agency that served youth, and that it's got some bugs.
Yeah.
Some things that she wanted to clarify. But they have conversations about fidelity on a regular basis, and they do talk about things like you had just mentioned, the fact that the scale has been used for working with people that are in the military, or working with youth, or one of the ones for the military is actually spinal cord injury. There was a gentleman from the VA that attended the international meeting last year that did a presentation on the efficacy of working within IPS with people with spinal cord injury, and it was a wonderful presentation and showed how very relevant IPS is for that population as well. So they have their international meeting coming up this May in Raleigh, and is that South Carolina or North Carolina? I can never remember.
I'm not sure.
I feel better, thank you. There's also an Ips Trainer Meeting in which they discuss various nuances, and they had one of those this morning, and discussed things that they want to pursue further, things that they want to address, not necessarily with a fidelity scale change, but just issues to bring up to consider when you're out talking with agencies, and how do the different IPS trainers do things. And so interesting meetings. And I think they're certainly open to whoever might want to attend in a lot of cases, but yeah. I'm not seeing any questions. You've done such a marvelous job, Paul, that no one has a question to ask, evidently.
Well, that is one interpretation, sure.
Strengths-based. Let's be strengths-based.
Yeah, I'm on board your train, sure.
So, does anyone have questions? All right. You know, one of the things that I would kind of add that we've done in the state of Washington, or at least I've done, and then I found out my colleague doesn't, is that we obviously do the written report with recommendations. There is a tool that we've subscribed to that we use that allows you to pull from some general recommendations and then individualize them to send out to the agency once all is done. And I have asked that agencies then go ahead and do an action plan. I've always felt that there's more accountability if you put in writing what you hope to do to change things. And then they would be something we would look at when we come back to do a follow-up review, and found out my colleague's not doing it that way. So we need to be a little more standard in the way that we do things, but it's something I know if I write things down, I tend to, number one, remember them. Number two, be a little more committed to them. So I've always asked for an action plan in return,
Sure.
giving them the report. Is that something that you do, Paul?
Yeah, we don't require it in Illinois or anything like that, but just from a IPS provider perspective, our team gets together after a Fidelity review and does the Fidelity action plan. And what we do then is we actually include the steering committee, the IPS steering committee, and the action planning discussion. And then throughout the year, the steering committee is who holds the IPS team accountable to the performance on the plan.
Right.
And with the idea being that next year, when the Fidelity reviewers come out, we should see a point increase on the Fidelity score that's correlated to the things we've been working on all year.
Yeah, it's going to be a busy year this year because we are doing follow-up reviews for those that had a baseline this year, and then we're doing additional baseline reviews for agencies that haven't had a baseline as yet. So we're increasing numbers of reviews that we're doing, which means that people that are interested in being reviewers, I would sure like to we'll have that incentive opportunity. And we're going to have quite a lot in the way of opportunities, I think, for people to be part of a review team should they choose to do so.
And I will say, as an IPS provider that went to become a Fidelity reviewer, my program became better because of my experience and observation reviewing other teams. It's a way to give your own program a bump in performance just based on how other people are doing IPS. I mean, really, what I tell people all the time here is, the best thing you learn as a provider who then becomes a reviewer is you get to see how other organizations solve all the problems you're trying to deal with your own team. And you kind of get to, take a good idea and make it your own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen form sharing and just a variety of things in regards to collaboration between review team members and then also agencies being reviewed and the review team members. Now, since it's not an audit, it's not a gotcha, it's a nice opportunity to collaborate with other people and get a chance to know them and what they're doing. And yeah, I have yet to hear somebody on a review team say, wow, that was a waste of time. Everybody has said that was such a marvelous learning opportunity, and I really appreciate the chance to do that. And people who have had reviews have said the same kind of thing. So I value it a great deal as a process. Let's see here. We ended up with smaller numbers today than anticipated. So my guess is some folks really did have difficulties getting into the webinar, and just didn't make it in. And so I will be sending this out, the recording out, to the list of people who registered. Feel free anytime that I send out a recording to a webinar to share it with your colleagues. And so if there was somebody that wanted to get on that was not able to, they will be able to at least listen to the recording. The other thing that's going to happen is we have a wiki. I don't know if everybody's familiar with the Supported Employment Wiki. It's essentially an online library. And I have to say right now it needs some cleanup, which is one of my projects. But after I've gotten done kind of archiving some of the older folders and that kind of thing, I'm going to put all of the PowerPoints from webinars this year on the wiki so that they will be available. The recordings are a little more difficult to do, but I think I can do that as well. So if in the future there's something that you want to view, either ask me because I save the recordings, or check the wiki, because probably January, February, it's going to be up to date with all of the different recordings and PowerPoints that we've had of webinars throughout the year.
Oh, that's great.
I will mention too, well, folks are thinking for a long time about questions they might have. We recently we contracted to do a series of benefits planning webinars with the Washington Initiative for Supported Employment, for those of you familiar with that agency. So we have a series of 4 two-hour webinars related to benefits planning. Watching them will not make you a benefits planner, but it'll give you enough of the basics to know when you're kind of out of your depth in regards to talking with individuals. Benefits planning is definitely part of Fidelity. Shows up in what, 2 items, doesn't it, Paul, about benefits planning, or is it just?
Yeah.
I think it's a couple.
I think it's 2. I think you're right. I think it's 2.
And so those webinars will be available as well. In fact, I have the recordings at this point in time if somebody wants to request them of me. And those will also be available on the wiki. I see April says, will you put out that wiki address location in the notes? Yes, I will. Absolutely. That, and I'll make sure to go ahead and put in also the pathways to employment, because there are good resources there too. Thanks for asking, April. I apologize. I have dogs and I hear them barking in the background. The joys of pet ownership. All right, other questions? If there are no other questions, and Paul, did you have some parting thoughts?
Well, I guess, yeah, parting thoughts would be, I know a Fidelity review seems like it should be a scary event to have, strangers descend upon you for 2 days to ask all kinds of questions about how you're doing the work that you do. But it is, once you've been through it, you'll realize that the reviewers are well-intentioned. They're not there to dock you points. That's not the purpose. They're not there to do gotchas, as Dawn said earlier. We really, as a reviewer, we really need you to set it up so that we get the best picture of how IPS works in your organization. And as long as you can commit to that, then you should have a very good review process. There shouldn't be any bumps. And again, every reviewer is a little bit different, but that's the beauty of having teams of reviewers, is that you don't have to, if you have somebody who is quote unquote, not a good reviewer, let's say, they're empowered by their reviewer team too. So, there's some insurance against, bad interpretation or those sorts of things that I think people worry about. And everybody really wants to do, all the providers I've ever, had the pleasure of connecting with, they all just want to do, have a good Fidelity review that shows that they do good work. And I can't say enough how important it is for people to understand that the scale is not designed for great programs to have the maximum number of points. That's not the only method of evaluation. You can have 107 points on the scale, for example, and still have a great program, because there's flexibility in the Fidelity scale for an organization to implement it kind of the way they need to in order for it to work. There are some things that are non-negotiables for sure, but there's flexibility in there. So if people can kind of reframe it instead of thinking about, maximum number of points possible, that's kind of how everything else in our world really works. This is a different thing. It's good to have the maximum number of points possible, but it's not bad if you don't.
Mm-hmm.
So really, once your points get you into Fidelity, then you have a program that is in Fidelity with the model.
Mm-hmm.
Period. Yeah.
Yep. I know as an agency, the agency that I worked for, when we had a Fidelity review, we scored in the fair range the first time around. The next couple of times we scored in the good range. And that fair score doesn't matter as much as the recommendations that we got. We didn't know Fidelity well at that point in time. And so those recommendations helped us to know where we needed more knowledge, where we needed more training or needed to change things or whatever. And so I always consider the baseline as kind of well, it's just that. It's just a baseline. It's just a picture at a point in time. And it gives you the opportunity to know what things you could improve upon, which I think is a gift, very honestly. I know we all like to grow and improve and change for the better, and that's what this allows agencies to do. So, alrighty, well, if there's no more questions, and I don't see any at this point in time, I will send out the PowerPoint and the recording and the Wiki address and Pathways to Employment address, and also the invitation to let me know if there's something else that you didn't get that you would like to see. And having said that, there will be supervisor learning community calls beginning again in January, I believe. Rutgers is taking over all of them. We're using Paul's expertise in kind of a different area next year. He's going to be doing some of the Fidelity Reviewer trainings. And so this will be Paul's last supervision learning collaborative call. I want to say, Paul, how much I appreciate your expertise and your knowledge and having done the presentations that you've done this year. Very, very much appreciated. And I'm really looking forward
to thank you.
Kind of the change in your role, if you will. I think is going to be neat to get to see you do the Fidelity Reviewer trainings too. So
yeah, it will be neat.
Thank you everyone for attending today. Happy holidays. I hope your holidays are joyful and peaceful. Thank you and have a good day.
All right. Thanks, Don.
Bye-bye.